Okay, good morning and thank you for joining us for the release of the preliminary results of Census 2022. I'm Eileen Murphy, I'm the Head of Census Administration, and I'm joined here this morning by Cormac Halpin, our Senior Statistician in Census Outputs, and our Statistician in Census Dissemination, Deirdre Lynch.
So the publication of these preliminary results less than 12 weeks after Census Night is only possible due to the dedication and commitment of our nearly 6,000 field staff, our Census HQ staff and swords, the wider support of the support areas of the Central Statistics Office, and of course the overwhelming responses from the public. The CSO would like to thank both the staff involved for their dedication and commitment to the project, and of course the continued support for the census from the public. The results provide valuable insights into how our population and housing has changed since our last census in 2016. So the main report will be published on our website in the coming minutes, and we're going to bring you through some of the main findings that are in that report. Just to let you know, we'll take any questions you may have at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, you can type it into the chat box, or if you raise your virtual hand, again, we'll get to you at the end of the presentation. And just to let you know that we will be recording the presentation, but we will stop the recording before the question and answer session. So I'm now going to hand over to Deirdre, who's going to bring you through those report findings.
Thank you, Eileen. Well, I'm delighted to be here today to take you all through the Census 2022 preliminary findings. Before we begin, I'll take you through some background on the overall project. So Census Night was the 3rd of April 2022, just under 12 weeks ago. It was 6 years since the previous census in 2016. This was due to the postponement of Census 2021 due to the pandemic.
Over 5,600 staff were recruited virtually. This was across 5,100 enumeration areas and included enumerators, liaison officers, regional and field supervisors. It was conducted over a 10-week period. There was 5 weeks for the delivery of census forms, followed by 5 weeks for collection of forms. This ran from the 4th of April through the 6th of May. It is important to note that preliminary figures are summaries of the headcount data for population and housing. So these are the enumerators' results. The count is de facto, so people were counted where they stayed on Census Night. People who were outside the state were not included in this count. Our official census publication will begin in Q2 of next year, 2023. So to set the presentation out, I will look at 3 topics. The first will be population by geographical changes. The second will be the reason for population changes. And the third will be housing. So to begin, we will look at the preliminary geography changes and population. So the preliminary census population number for 2022 was 5.12 million. So there was 5.12 million people in the state on Census Night. This included 49% that were male and 51 that were female. So this includes an increase of 8% on 2016 results, which was an increase of 360,000 persons. We can look at the graph appearing on your screen. This shows the years from 1841 to 2022 for the census population. You can see that it's the highest population figure since before the famine in 1841, and it's the first time the population has been over 5 million since 1851. It's twice the increase seen between 2011 and 16, which was a 4% increase, but it is important to note that this was a similar growth compared with previous periods. Annually, looking at the average, it's an increase of 1.2% between 2016 and 2022, whereas the growth was 0.8% between 2011 and 16. So where did this increase occur? We now look at this change by county level. So it's really important to note that all counties in Ireland experienced an increase in population for Census 2022. Looking at the map, you can see the east of the country experienced a high population increase, followed by some in the Midlands. So the highest population increase in percentage terms was County Longford with the 14% increase. But it is important to note that this county has the second lowest population in Ireland. Additionally, there was some tourism changes in the county since the previous census. Looking to the east of the country, Meath had an increase of 13%, followed by Fingal and Kildare with 11% in each, and in numerical terms, it is higher. So the lowest population increase, with 5% in each, was Donegal, Kilkenny, Kerry and Tipperary. We will look at the Dáil constituencies now by population. The average number of people per TD for the state in 2022 was 32,000. 38 of the 39 Dáil constituencies had more than 30,000 people per TD. Limerick County had the lowest number, and it was the only county that fell beneath the 30,000 threshold. The fastest growing Dáil constituency was Meath East with a 13% increase, whereas the slowest was Donegal and Limerick County with 4% in each. We now move on to the second section of the presentation. So we will look at the reasons for population change in 2022. So what drove the population? By means of background, we have vital statistics that give us the natural increase in the population. This is provided by registered births and deaths, and it is important to note that this data is provisional. With this, we can calculate net migration. When we say net migration in this topic, we mean people coming into the country. So with that being said, the natural increase is made up of 171,000 in Census 2022, the births minus the deaths. Whereas the estimated net migration, so the people that came into the country over the 6-year period between 2016 and 2022, was 190,000. Sometimes it can be useful to look at these figures in an average annual way. It lets us compare periods across census. So looking at this graph, we can see between 2016 and 2022, annually, there was an average of 31,000 people coming into Ireland. This differs to that seen between 2011 and 16, where there was an average of 5,000 people leaving the country. When we look at the natural increase on the graph, we can see between 2016 and 2022, there was 28,000 people, an increase, with 39,000 between 2011 and 16. So when we look at this net migration by county level, so where are the people coming into the country and what county are they going to? The largest inward migration was Dublin. This was followed by Cork and Meath. Monaghan, Kilkenny and Offaly experienced the lowest number of people coming to those counties. It can be useful for us to look at the populations relative to the county size per thousand of the population. So with that being said, Longford recorded the highest number of people coming in to the country with 16 people annually per thousand of population between 2016 and 2022. Meath followed this with 12 additional people and Leitrim with 11 additional people per year per thousand of population. Kilkenny had the lowest rate of people coming in with 3 people per thousand of population. This brings us to the third and final section of this presentation. We will now talk about the preliminary census results for housing. So the purpose of this slide is to show the change in housing stock versus population. The housing stock grew by 120,000 in 2022. This was a 6% increase compared to that of 2016. So the housing stock has reached over 2.1 million. This does differ to the period between 2011 and 16, where the housing stock increased by 8,800 units, or less than 1%. Occupied dwellings also increased compared to 2016 by 9%, which was an additional 150,000 dwellings. So the housing stock change. We will now look at where in Ireland the housing stock change occurred. The figure appearing on the screen shows the east of the country had the highest rates of change in terms of the housing stock. In Kildare and Meath, the housing stock increased by 12%. Wicklow was up by 9%, followed by Dublin and Louth with 7 in each. There was modest increases in each of Tipperary, Leitrim, Roscommon and Donegal, so the more rural counties, with an increase of 3% in the housing stock. However, it should be noted that the occupied dwellings in these counties did increase at more than twice the rate of the housing stock. So the housing stock versus the population change. In our analysis, we felt it was important to look at the housing growth versus the population growth among the counties. When looking at this, we found Kildare was the only county that had a higher increase in the housing stock compared to the population. So Kildare experienced a 12% increase in the housing stock against an 11% increase among the population. The story differed in Leitrim, whereas there was a 3,000 additional people in the county, a 10% increase, whereas the housing stock increased by 600 units, which was 3%. A similar story happened in Roscommon, where the population increased by over 8% and the housing stock rose by 3%. We now move on to the census vacancy, but before we do, we must set out the vacancy rate definition. It's important to note that the census vacancy analysis is a point-in-time indicator taken on census night as to whether the property was inhabited or not on Sunday, the 3rd of April. It does not necessarily mean that they are available for reuse or to house other people. The census vacancy contains many dwellings that may be unoccupied for a relatively short period of time. It should not be used as a proxy for long-term vacant dwelling. The census vacancy definition has been used over several census periods, and so it does enable us to undertake some comparisons over time. In Census 2022, it was also possible for the enumerators to record the reason for vacancy. If you look at the screen, you will see those reasons set out. This reason was often confirmed by neighbours, guests, and local knowledge. On occasion, there was more than one reason why the enumerator discovered the house was vacant, and they were only required to complete one. An example of this would be recently deceased and for sale. The rental property category in this does include dwellings that were advertised as being for rent, short-term, Airbnbs, and properties between lets. The other category included dwellings for which the enumerator could not clearly ascertain a reason for vacancy. So remembering our definition, that census vacancy is a point in time and does not indicate long-term vacancy. The census found 166 vacant dwellings in census 2022. 1,000 dwellings in 2022. This has fallen by 9% compared with 2016. Which was a 16,000 reduction, down from the figure published in 2016 of 183,000 dwellings. This is a further reduction of 12% when compared with 2011. So the vacancy rate for the state was 7.8% in 2022. We continue to look at this vacancy rate by county. So on the map, you will see that the North East was predominantly higher rates for vacancy. We did note in our analysis that the rates did differ between counties with more urban populations and more rural counties. For example, in Meath, the vacancy rate fell by less than 1 percentage point from under 7% in 2016 to 6% in 2022. Whereas in Roscommon, the census vacancy rate fell 4 percentage points, down to 13% from 17%. So we can now look at the reasons for vacancy established by the enumerators for these properties. Remembering the definition of rental property, this accounted for 21% of properties. The for sale category accounted for 11% of vacant dwellings, and this included sale agreed or recently sold. An interesting story emerges when we look at the vacancy reason by county. For instance, Galway City and Dublin City had the highest proportion of vacant rental properties, whereas Roscommon, Galway and Mayo were most often vacant because the owner was deceased. Leitrim and Sligo had the highest number of abandoned farm homes. As I said earlier, our census vacancy definition is a point in time and does not indicate long-term vacancy. However, we have captured this definition over census periods, which includes 2011, 16 and 2022. So we were able to do some analysis on those over time. Over 90% of vacant dwellings in census 2022 could be linked to 2016. Almost 85% could be linked to 2011. Of the 166,000 vacant dwellings in 2022, almost 1 in 3 of the dwellings that could be linked were also vacant in 2016. This accounted for 48,000 properties. If we look at the map, we can see where the emphasis of those properties were found. Looking at this in further detail, of those 48,000 dwellings linked over the 2 census periods, nearly half again, 23,000, were also vacant in census 2011. So that brings us nicely on to our final slide to summarise the points outlined in this presentation. The population was 5.1 million in census 2022, an increase of 8%. It was the highest population since 1841, before the famine, and the first time the population was over 5 million since 1851. The housing stock increased by 120,000, which was up 6%. The number of occupied dwellings increased by 9% compared with that of 2016. And the point-in-time measure of census vacancy rate was 7.8%, which had fallen 9%, and it does not indicate long-term vacancy. Thank you very much, and I'll pass you back to Eileen.
Thank you, Deirdre. And I think it's a great milestone to have hit the highest population recorded in a census since before the famine in 1841 at 5.12 million. And I'd again like to thank all those whose commitment to the project has ensured that we were able to bring you these results less than 12 weeks after census night. I think it shows the value of the census to be able to trace those multiple changes in our country over time, the fact that we can refer back those 180 years for this data, and how this current census, as well as planning for our immediate needs, will provide insights well into the future. And I'm thinking in particular of the opening of our new time capsule section in 100 years' time in 21-22. So certainly on my part, it's been a pleasure to play a small part in census history.